Let's talk about the state of ethics today. First, we're going to do an overview of the history of philosophy, and then I'm going to talk about Bernard Williams and his argument against moral objectivism. And then contrasting this, I'm going to give C.S. Lewis's defense of objective morality and his right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe, taken from his book, Mere Christianity. And then contrasting again, I'm going to propose Albert Camus' Absurdism, and then contrasting this will be William Lane Craig in his essay, his article, The Absurdity of Life Without God. And then I'm going to follow up with Alasdair MacIntyre's assessment of the history of philosophy, particularly focused on ethics, taken from his book After Virtue and his chapters A Disquieting Suggestion and The Nature of Moral Disagreement Today. First, an overview of the history of philosophy. This is the timeline of philosophy. First, we start out with Thales of Miletus introducing the pre-Socratics, and then eventually we have Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, where we first have philosophy arise as a science. And then comes Hellenism, which is the spread of Greek culture and influence throughout the world after Alexander the Great. Eventually we have the birth of Christ, and Hellenism continues as it influences the Roman Empire and as the Roman Empire spreads. All through this time, there's a generally consistent way of doing philosophy in that it is characterized largely by metaphysics and somewhat by ethics, so that metaphysics seeks to know what is real about the world. What is the nature of the world? And based on the nature of, that is, human nature, we can talk about ethics. And also, after we know something about the real world, the universe, then we can start to think about thinking. How do we think? This method continues into the Middle Ages, started with Augustine around 354 and up to the 1500s. We have the Middle Ages, or the medieval period. Right in the middle of this, we have Thomas Aquinas as probably the apex of medieval philosophy. He largely adopted and adapted Aristotle's philosophy and sort of Christianized it. And then right after him we have William of Ockham, was sort of a man before his time who denied universals, denied essences, denied things like human nature, denied these universal concepts, and he became a forerunner of the Enlightenment. Of course, there's many other philosophers through the Middle Ages, but this is just talking about the highlights. And then we have René Descartes, who was born in 1596, and he proposed a totally new way of doing philosophy. He shifted the focus away from metaphysics and onto the self, onto epistemology. So before René Descartes, it was generally accepted that first you know something about the world, and then you figure out afterwards how you figured things out, or how you learn. So that whenever you think about thinking, you can't do that until you already have concepts in your mind that you have learned from the universe. Now René Descartes switches this around and says that knowledge, instead of knowledge beginning with experience and then later involving reason, he says that it first and foremost just comes from reason. That we suspect the reliability of our sensory experience. So this introduces rationalism. And it sets the trajectory of the history of philosophy on a new course and issues in the Enlightenment. Enlightenment is the period of time, and modernism is the general philosophical school of thought, which was trying to base knowledge off of reason and off of sensory experience rather than off of metaphysics. And so they were still realists, saying the universe is real and we can really know things about reality. That's the Enlightenment. And then through the Enlightenment we have, for example, John Locke, who was an empiricist, saying that all knowledge comes through our senses and that we are born knowing nothing. We have David Hume, who says morals are merely expressions of emotion instead of expressions of metaphysical human nature. And then we have Immanuel Kant, who issues in postmodernism. He comes at the end of the Enlightenment modernism, because in the Enlightenment, sensory experience and reason were divorced into two separate and competing philosophies. So you have rationalism versus empiricism. Immanuel Kant, taking a note from classical thinkers, tries to recombine observation and reason, but he does so in his own way. And in doing so, he says that we cannot know reality as it is in itself. All we can know is how it appears to us. And so this begins anti-realism, and postmodernism ensues, where the focus shifts away from epistemology and even onto ethics. So you start to get existentialists like Soren Kierkegaard, who say that ethics is rationalistically based, because he is thinking about the ethics of the Enlightenment, and that true meaning is found in leaping beyond this rationalistic understanding into, through an act of will, one leaps beyond this rationalistic understanding of ethics into a meaningful life. And then later we have further developments in existentialism through Friedrich Nietzsche, who proposes existential nihilism, saying that there is no meaning to the universe and we cannot give it one. And then last of all, we have 20th century existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, who propose absurdism. Albert Camus is the one we are especially going to look at. So by the present day, we have polar opposites. We have the full implications of the Enlightenment rejection of metaphysical human nature as the foundation for morality. What is the fullest implication of that? Well, we will see with Albert Camus. And then also, what is the furthest implication of continuing on with the medieval method of doing philosophy? So these two extremes, there may be different varieties and degrees of things in between, but I present the opposite extremes as juxtapositions so that you can learn and figure out for yourself where you want to land, and also what the implications of each are. Alright, so let's just compare three different general phases of, you might say, epochs of philosophical history. Classical, which is to say ancient and medieval, modernity, which is to say the Enlightenment philosophers, and then post-modernity. Alright? So in terms of philosophical focus, the classical philosophers focused on metaphysics and ethics. Modernity shifted the focus to epistemology and ethics, while post-modernity gave less focus on epistemology and some more focus on ethics. So a big difference between modernity and post-modernity will come out here in a second as we talk about metaphysics. So classical metaphysics will be realist. It will assent to realism, which says that the universe, physical and metaphysical, is real. There is a real universe and we can know real things about it. We actually can know about the world. Modernity emphasizes realism as well, but it reduces it to naturalism, saying often that the only thing that exists is the material world, at least at the latter end of modernity and the Enlightenment. And then in post-modernity we have anti-realism, which says that we cannot know what reality is. What are we even talking about when we say reality? Because whenever we talk about reality, we are only talking about the appearances in our own mind, and we cannot actually know what reality is. And then in the area of epistemology, classical philosophers emphasize that observation and reason are both required together, cooperating, as the source and test for knowledge. Reality is observed first, and then we reflect on what we know from reality in order to figure out epistemology, that is, how we learn. Modernity divorces observation and reason, separates them into two competing categories. So we have rationalism, for example, in René Descartes, which says that reason is the source and test for knowledge. But competing with this, we have empiricism, which says observation is the source and test for knowledge. And then in phenomenology, we say instead that we study phenomenology, which is the study of the states of consciousness and the elements of experience. That's because we can't actually know about reality. So we can't have rationalism or empiricism or classical philosophy. All we can study is our states of consciousness. And then we have some implications of these. In classical philosophy, ethics and epistemology are based on metaphysics, whereas in modernity, observation and reason become competing philosophies. Verification and skepticism ensue. So verificationism says that you should not believe something unless you have proven it beyond a shadow of a doubt with absolute certainty from sensory experience. Of course, that strict and stringent of a standard of proof quickly becomes it's evident that it is impossible. And so if that is the standard for knowledge, then we can't have that standard and we can't know anything. So we have skepticism, which says that we cannot know things. We cannot know anything for certain or with truth. And then in postmodernity, the implications are that metaphysics is impossible, epistemology is limited, and ethics is mere opinion. So in terms of ethics, in classical philosophy, we have a strong objectivism based on human nature as a metaphysical universal teleology, which gives rise to virtue ethics, talking about certain character traits that are exemplary virtues and that express the moral life. And then in modernity, we have a weak objectivism based on universalism. In deontology, for example, we have universal rules that apply to everyone, but it's based on reason rather than on metaphysics. And then or the competing philosophy is consequentialism, which is a sort of moderate relativism or perhaps still a limited objectivism based on teleology, which is to say that the ends justify the means. And then in postmodernity, both of those are rejected, a rationalistic foundation for ethics, and so what is proposed instead is, for example, Nietzsche's nihilism, where he says that there is no meaning in life and that ethics is oppressive, and so we should reject ethics, we should reject good and evil, and assent to the fact that there is no meaning in the universe. And then absurdism is the same, only it also acknowledges that we have an inherent drive within us seeking meaning. So humans seek meaning, and there's no meaning in the universe. And this contradiction is absurd. The best thing we can do is just embrace the absurdity. We'll see more about that here in a bit. And also a strong relativism. We'll see how that plays out as well. The Enlightenment caused a great break in philosophy. What are the furthest implications of both traditions? Nietzsche's nihilism versus Aristotelian realism. We will not look at these two in great detail, but we will see some of the most recent and prominent expressions of each of these camps, and we will explain why these two camps, why these two philosophies are drawn out from among others as the furthest implications of both traditions, both the Enlightenment and classical philosophy. Against moral objectivism, from Bernard Williams' Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy. So here's a question. Think of one thing you know is wrong, and one thing you know is morally obligatory. For example, murder and loyalty to friends or family, something like that. Just take a second. One thing you know is morally obligatory, or one thing you know is wrong. Are these personal preference or objective? How do we know? Bernard Williams proposes that science might be objective, but ethics cannot be. He says science has some chance of being an account of how the world really is, while ethical thought has no such chance. As a test, he develops an idea called convergence. Convergence is the process whereby disagreements gradually give way to agreement. Disagreements in science are some of these examples. String theory is still debated, or the cause of climate change, how much or if at all humans affect climate change, or the health effects of sugar, or whether or not there is such a thing as the multiverse. These are examples of debates that are still going on in science, but hopefully ideas and debates will converge and gradually we will gain agreement. Disagreements in ethics might include abortion or gender issues, doctor-assisted suicide, or animal rights. Why is convergence in ethics improbable, according to Bernard Williams? He says, our conception of the world as the object of our beliefs can do no better than repeat the beliefs we take to represent it. That's such an important phrase, I'm going to say it again. Our conception of the world as the object of our beliefs can do no better than repeat the beliefs we take to represent it. He continues, if on the other hand we try to form some idea of a world that is prior to any description of it, then we have an empty notion of something completely unspecified and unspecifiable. In other words, if you try to describe the world as it is in itself, without your opinion being involved, then you have an empty concept. Because whatever you think the world really is, that is your opinion. And so you can't talk about it without your opinion. Taking after Kant, Williams denies sense realism, which is to say that our senses give true knowledge, true and direct knowledge of the real universe. So he denies sense realism and says that we cannot know things in themselves, but only appearances. So here's some assumptions that he is working off of. He is assuming phenomenology of Kant. He's assuming naturalism and the scientific method, that the universe is only material and there are no metaphysical entities. Also a limited anti-realism, that we cannot know reality as it is in itself. And a denial of human nature, along with a broader denial of universals. So he's already bought into much of the Enlightenment philosophy, and it's because of that that he can conclude that we can't speak about reality separate from our bias. When we debate science, we can point to physical evidence. When we debate ethics, we can't point beyond our own opinion. Any attempt to do so only points to other opinions we have. Talk about the way the world really is in ethics is just an assertion of our opinion, a repetition of our bias. We can't test it by measuring something. He says we must reject the objectivist view of ethical life as a pursuit of ethical truth. Ethical convergence is extremely unlikely, according to Bernard Williams. But if it happens, there's only one way to hope for this. Basing ethics on human nature, kind of like Aristotle. So how can this happen, according to Bernard Williams? We should first find consensus that a certain kind of life is best for human beings. He says the project of giving to the ethical life an objective and determinate grounding in considerations about human nature is not, in my view, very likely to succeed. But it is at any rate a comprehensible project. The convergence that signaled the success of this project would be a convergence of practical reason, by which people came to lead the best kind of life, and to have the desires that belong to that life. Convergence in ethical belief would largely be a part and consequence of that process. This would be a structure very different from that of the objectivity of science. There would be a radical difference between ethics and science, even if ethics were objective in the only way in which it intelligibly could be. So he says through consensus in trial and error, kind of like Mill's view of morals as social consensus, or Nietzsche's genealogy of morals. Through this sort of consensus of trial and error, we might be able to achieve convergence and agreement in ethics. But he says it is not very likely. And the objectivism that might be produced would be a sort of consequentialist objectivism, and not an objectivism that makes truth claims about reality known as the thing in itself. Here's a preliminary response. Williams assumes the notorious fact-value distinction. The fact-value distinction says that facts describe the objective world and values express subjective opinion. This is circular reasoning. The argument for relativism begins by assuming relativism. Objectivism, rather, would say that values are facts about the world. So what is a value? Something like human life is valuable. That is a value. So with the fact-value distinction, it would say that there is a fact that humans exist, and the value that humans should be valued is a subjective opinion. But objectivism is going to say it is an objectively true, universally true thing about the world that human life is valuable. It's intrinsically valuable. So how can we investigate reality without merely describing our biases? Well, we can use critical thinking, use logic to compare competing justifications. We can see that logic is self-evident, just like math. In fact, even more fundamental than math. So something cannot be true and false at the same time and in the same way. This is one of the laws of logic. We take these kinds of laws of logic and apply them to different arguments in order to assess how valid different arguments are. So we can compare arguments using logic. Logic can be shown to be universally objective and self-evident. We can also seek common ground, then investigate the logical implications of that common ground. This is the same method we use to investigate science. So using this critical thinking method based on logic, we can find things that are absolutely objectively true and use those to assess different arguments that people have. So as we investigate reality without merely describing our bias, it's important to acknowledge that physical science is limited and many things are outside the bounds of the scientific method. So if we say that science is objective but ethics is not, well, everything that science is built on must also be objective. Alright? And this is just to point to that there must be many things outside of science that are objective, if you assume that science is objective. Right? In the scientific method, it starts with observation, you gain a hypothesis, you run a test, you measure the test, and then you repeat the test. So what are things that are outside of the scientific method? Well, logic and math are presupposed by science. Science does not prove them, rather, they prove science. History. We can go to a crime scene and look at the effects of a crime, but we cannot actually see the crime. We cannot repeat the crime. We see these effects and we interpret them. So history is not repeatable. We cannot observe history. But that's not to say we can't prove things about history. Also, whether God exists, or whether anything exists. What about the material world? The scientific method does not prove that the material world actually exists. It assumes that it actually exists. Also, the scientific method cannot prove that the scientific method is valid. That would be circular reasoning. Rather, the scientific method is shown to be valid based on some philosophy that came before. Right? Also, we need to remember that evidence and proof refer to reason, not merely physical evidence. It is super common today to think that evidence and proof only refer to someone in a white lab coat in a laboratory somewhere who's putting chemicals into a beaker and making things explode, right? So when you hear the word evidence or proof, you think of a scientist doing some sort of physical experiment. But evidence and proof actually refer to an argument, the justification in an argument. And there are many things, there are many ways of arguing besides just physical evidence. Of course, physical evidence is an important kind of evidence, but there are other ways to talk about evidence. For example, talking about logic or math, right? So where does Bernard Williams leave us? Ethics is nothing but opinion. It is subjective relativism. We have an irreconcilable pluralism. Interestingly enough, Bernard Williams attacks utilitarianism quite a bit. Utilitarianism as saying that the ends justify the means. But at the same time, does he really leave us with any other option? It seems that the answer is no. Now let's talk about C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. His first section of the book is entitled Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. This contrasts Bernard Williams by being a defense of objective morality. This is just going to be a quick overview, but I encourage you to watch some other videos on C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity to get a more detailed understanding of his argument. So contrasting subjectivism, we may look at C.S. Lewis in the Aristotelian tradition. He develops the kind of objective morality based on human nature that Bernard Williams mentioned. Of course, as we think about the Enlightenment as branching off from classical philosophy, we might take heed with C.S. Lewis's quote here. He says, "We all want progress, but if you're on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. In that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive." In Book 1, Chapter 1, entitled Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe, C.S. Lewis begins by observing common experience. He says, "Everyone has heard people quarreling, so when we fight or argue with people, we try to explain why we are right and why they are wrong. We say things like, 'That's not fair, and you shouldn't do that.' We seem to appeal to a shared standard, something we call fair play or decent behavior. How do we speak about the Nazis? We say they are wrong for their tyranny. We might say there is no ultimate right and wrong, but the next minute we will be offended by someone who cheats us or is unfair. When we are offended by their misbehavior, we claim they are unfair and ought to have acted otherwise. As you see, we only say there are no morals when all is well, but we invoke them when it is not. It is evident that we all have some sense of what we can call the moral law or the law of nature. Now, this isn't to say that it doesn't often look different in different cultures, or that some people may be mistaken. This is just the same as saying that we might get our math wrong, or people might drive on the other side of the road in another country, but these still point to something universal. We are also aware that we do not in fact keep our own standards of behavior. We often fail and give some excuse and say, "I'll try better next time." Are you perfect? We all answer no. The main points. Humans have an innate idea of the moral law, and humans know they don't obey it. In the second chapter, Lewis entertains some objections. So what is the moral law? One objection is that the moral law is only an instinct. Instinct is a strong desire to act in a certain way. This is different than feeling you ought to help or do something moral. For example, when someone in danger cries help, two instincts trigger, the desire to help and your own self-preservation. How do you pick between two instincts that are in conflict? Is it merely the stronger instinct that wins? No, the moral law tells us which instinct we ought to follow, which is often the weaker one, like helping over self-preservation. Our impulses are not good or bad. The moral law in us tells us when to encourage or discourage them. Another objection. Moral laws are invented and taught as social conventions. For example, which side of the road should we drive on? It's a social convention. However, something taught may not be invented. Math is taught, but our teachers didn't invent it. Do you ever critique another culture, saying that it should improve? Were the Nazis wrong? Is it wrong to have racism, oppression of free speech, and slavery? Right? Are these merely social conventions? Or is this something objectively true? As we critique other cultures, how do we critique other cultures if our sense of morals are only a social convention? If we say one culture is better than another or that our culture has progress, we are measuring them by something outside of culture, namely the moral law. Here's the main points. When two instincts conflict, something outside of instinct helps us judge which to follow. When we say how culture should act, we refer to something outside of social convention. Chapter 3, The Reality of the Moral Law, Lewis entertains another objection. Isn't moral law, or the law of nature, just a description about what is convenient for me? Well, no. When we stub our foot on a rock or weeds grow in our garden, these are inconvenient, but we don't call them morally bad. When a dog eats our homework, we don't call it theft. If someone trips you on purpose or by accident, we call one rude and we excuse the other, even though they are equally inconvenient. The law of human nature is not like the laws of nature. Right? Human nature says what we ought to do, which is different than what we actually do. Physical nature, the laws of physical nature, like the law of gravity, only describes what things actually do, and does not distinguish between what they ought to do. So another objection says, instead of saying morality is based on objective human nature, can't we just say it is the convention of acting for the greater good of others? Well, yes, in a sense, because of course morality is acting for the greater good of others. But that really only describes what morality is. it does not answer the question, why be moral? It does not really answer the question. It just describes the question. Here's the main points. What we do is not the same as what we should do. There must be a law telling us otherwise. Chapter 4. What lies behind the moral law? So far we know what we actually do, and something in us also says what we should do. There are three main views to choose from on what's going on here. The naturalism, or the materialist view, which says nothing exists but the universe, the physical universe. Then there's the religious view, that says there is something behind the universe, giving it order, something like a mind. This is not even any particular religion. The last view is what Lewis calls life force philosophy, or New Age philosophy as it's called today. The universe has an impersonal striving, or purposiveness. This provides a sense of spirituality when one wants to feel like the universe is meaning, but it still lets us do whatever we want because it is impersonal. He says you cannot find out which view is the right one by science in the ordinary sense. Science works by experiments. It watches how things behave. Every scientific statement in the long run, however complicated it looks, really means something like, I pointed the telescope to such and such a part of the sky at 2:20 a.m. on January the 15th, and saw so-and-so. Or, I put some of this stuff in a pot and heated it to such and such a temperature, and it did so-and-so. Do not think I am saying anything against science. I am only saying what its job is. And the more scientific a man is, the more, I believe, he would agree with me that this is the job of science. And a very useful and necessary job it is too. But why anything comes to be there at all, and whether there is anything behind the things science observes, something of a different kind, this is not a scientific question. If there is something behind, then either it will have to remain altogether unknown to men, or else make itself known in some different way. The statement that there is any such thing, and the statement that there is no such thing, are neither of them statements that science can make. So how do we know if something lies behind the moral law? We cannot tell by observing the external world. We can only tell by looking at ourselves. Inside our minds we experience our conscience, attempting to guide our behavior, and excusing or accusing our past behavior. In our conscience we see that there is a difference between what we actually do and what we should do. At this point we do not know what is behind the moral law, only that there seems to be in our minds a set of general guidelines that we did not put there. It is in this way that we begin to feel responsible. Here's the main point. We did not invent the moral law, but find it in us. There seems to be a mind that put it in us. Chapter 5. We have cause to be uneasy. So far we have some sense of morality we did not invent. This is not yet religion. You may think, we've tried that and it didn't work. There's no sense in going backwards. However, we all want progress, but if you're on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. In that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive. What is this mind behind the moral law? We have two ways of observing. We have external observation of the external world, in which we can't learn much. Perhaps that this mind is merciless. And then inside ourselves, we see obligation and something like justice. The conclusion from this is that the moral law is uncompromising. If this is all we know of God, then it does not seem to be a person who loves and has mercy. It is only so far an uncompromising power or principle. We may ask, are we on the same side as this moral force or mind? We seem to want its approval with our conscience, but we also secretly agree with its judgment of us. If this mind is the standard of moral goodness, it is both our only hope of becoming good, and we have made ourselves its enemies. He says, this is the terrible fix we are in. If the universe is not governed by an absolute goodness, then all our efforts are in the long run hopeless. But if it is, then we are making ourselves enemies to that goodness every day, and are not in the least likely to do any better tomorrow. And so our case is hopeless again. We cannot do without it, and we cannot do with it. God is the only comfort. He is also the supreme terror, the thing we most need and the thing we most want to hide from. He is our only possible ally, and we have made ourselves his enemies. Some people talk as if meeting the gaze of absolute goodness would be fun. They need to think again. Goodness is dangerous. Here's the main points. If there is a problem with morals today, we may need to recover something we've lost. The moral law gives hope of a meaningful life, but we have broken it. Objectivism is necessary for Christianity. You can only repent of immorality if you agree that there is something like the moral law. So this is to say that much of Lewis's argument can be taken without necessarily coming to all the same conclusions, such as Christianity, as him. But then again, maybe it cannot. You tell me. Book 3, Chapter 1, he discusses the 3 parts of morality. What are morals? Rules that stop you from having fun? Or guidelines for running the human machine properly? Are morals ideals? Well, yes. It is the perfect way for humans to function. But then again, no, if you think of it in this way. Sometimes what we mean by ideal is something like, this is my ideal house, or car, or job, which doesn't refer to morals. So here's the 3 parts of morality with an illustration. We have ships sailing on the ocean. The first element of morality is relational, that is, fair play and harmony with others. So these ships will not be able to reach their destination if they don't play well with each other. They will crash into each other. So in ethics, we want to make sure that we're treating other people well. Second, our own internal order, our harmonizing of ourselves. Do we want good things? Do we have good character? Are we aimed at good goals? And do we cultivate our own personal morality and not simply just what people notice about us? Do we have an inner sense of conscience that we try to follow? And then third, the ultimate goal, which is the general purpose of human life as a whole. Where is this fleet of ships sailing? Which island are they getting at? Can you have one without the others? It seems not. Because if they are not all headed to the same destination, then they will crash into each other. Or if some of the ships have no internal order and harmony with themselves, then they will not function well. They will not steer well, and they will steer into others. So this is to say that you need all 3 in order to have any of them. What does this mean? Some observations about this. If morality is just social convention, just relational, like in number 1, then we would have relatively few disagreements about morality. All 3 elements depend on each other. You can't have number 1, which is relational morals, without the others. You might say, I can do what I want so long as I don't harm others. If you are not also concerned with the morality of your own private life, you will become so immoral that you will collide with others around you. If you have a different goal, a different moral standard you are aiming at, number 3, then you will collide with others. That is why we have so many disagreements in society today. If we are to have an adequate morality, we need to agree on general morals that we are aiming at. The moral standard, number 3, determines our private lives, number 2, and how we relate to others in society, number 1. So they are all interrelated. How do we gain the same standard? Now let's look at a contrasting view in Albert Camus' Absurdism, presented in The Myth of Sisyphus. How do we live a meaningful life? Here's a historic recap that leads up to Absurdism. The ancient philosophers proposed human nature, or essence, is the metaphysical universal teleology, meaning that all people, universal, have the same nature. To fulfill this goal of a flourishing human life, this telos, this end, to fulfill the proper function of human nature, one must cultivate virtues in virtue ethics to have the happy and meaningful life of human flourishing. And then you have the medieval philosophers that accept this and build on the ancient metaethics and metaphysics and add that this is fulfilled, that the meaningful life is ultimately fulfilled in union with God, and that all morality aims at God. And then in the Enlightenment, we have a rejection of everything that has come before, saying that ethics denies metaphysical foundation and tries to found morality on human reason alone. Ethics now exclusively emphasizes the universal aspect of morality, as in Kant's deontology, or the teleological element, as in Hume Mill's consequentialism. And then later in early postmodernism, rationalistic ethics is seen as empty of meaning and must be overcome with a radical act of the will, in a leap of faith, as in Kierkegaard, in which a person creates their own meaning, as in existentialism, which Kierkegaard is the father of existentialism, often considered. Friedrich Nietzsche, within this tradition, says the Enlightenment project failed to find a new foundation for morality because morality doesn't exist. His existential nihilism says that life has no meaning. Instead, we can overcome morality, seize power, and force others to our will, in the will to power, in Nietzsche's Overman. So an existentialism recap of some of the main principles of existentialism. Existence precedes essence. So in classical philosophy, essence was primary. There was such a thing as human nature, and that existed long before I was born. And so my existence is defined by that preeminent essence, so that my life conforms to that essence. However, in existentialism, it flips it around. There's no such thing as a universal essence of human nature. First and foremost, I exist, and then I choose my own nature and essence through my choices. Reason and ethics are overcome through will to power and self-creation. Also, existentialism proposes a denial of universals and teleology, fundamentally. Albert Camus says that none of our attempts to gain a meaningful life ultimately proves meaningful. The will to power in Nietzsche does not create any meaning. Family life, or charity, or power, or love, or legacy all amount to nothing in the end. Once you're dead, will your life really matter in the course of history? Camus proposes absurdism, which is to say humans seek meaning in a meaningless universe. Humans have an inherent longing for a meaningful life. Life and the universe, however, have no meaning, and we can't give it one. This contradiction is absurd. All we can do is embrace the absurdity. We face the threat of purposelessness and futility in the drudgery of a meaningless life. Camus presents absurdism through the myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus, being near to death, rashly wanted to test his wife's love. He ordered her to cast his unburied body into the middle of the public square. Sisyphus woke up in the underworld, and there, annoyed by an obedience so contrary to human love, he obtained from Pluto permission to return to earth in order to chastise his wife. But when he had seen again the face of this world, enjoyed water and sun, warm stones and the sea, he no longer wanted to go back to the infernal darkness. Mercury came and seized the impudent man by the collar, and snatching him from his joys, led him forcibly back to the underworld, where his rock was ready for him. The gods had condemned Sisyphus to ceaselessly rolling a rock up to the top of a mountain, whence the stone would fall back of its own weight. They had thought with some reason that there is no more dreadful punishment than futile and hopeless labor. Sisyphus is the absurd hero. He is as much through his passions as through his torture. His scorn of the gods, his hatred of death, and his passion for life won him that unspeakable penalty in which the whole being is exerted towards accomplishing nothing. So he is seen by Camus as a hero because he is defying the gods in his passion. He is embracing his meaningless drudgery of a punishment. He is a hero. Let's see more of Camus' analysis to see why he is a hero. One sees merely the whole effort of a body, straining to raise the huge stone, to roll it and push it up a slope 100 times over. One sees the face screwed up, the cheek tight against the stone, the shoulder bracing the clay-covered mass, the foot wedged in, the fresh start with arms outstretched, the wholly human security of two earth-clodding hands. At the very end of his long effort, measured by skyless space and time, without depth, the purpose is achieved. Then Sisyphus watches the stone rush down in a few moments towards that lower world, whence he will have to push it up again towards the summit. He goes back down to the plain. It is during that return, that pause, that Sisyphus interests me, a face that toils so close to stones, is already stone itself. I see that man going back down with a heavy yet measured step towards the torment of which he will never know the end. The hour like a breathing space which turns as surely as his suffering. That is the hour of consciousness. The hour of consciousness. At each of those moments, when he leaves the heights and gradually sinks toward the lairs of the gods, he is superior to his fate. He is stronger than his rock. So in that moment at the top of the hill, when he turns around and he sees that he is going to have to start over, in that moment is the full embrace of his task, or it is the fullest of his depression. In that moment, he can either have hope, or he can embrace the meaningless drudgery of infinite regress in front of him. In that moment, if he hopes, then he despairs. But instead, he embraces the drudgery and absurdism of his life. And so he is stronger than his rock and superior to his fate. All Sisyphus' silent joy is contained therein. His fate belongs to him. He takes ownership of his absurdity. The night has no end. He is still to go on. The rock is still rolling. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Here's the conclusion that Camus' absurdism brings forth. All people seek a meaningful life. Life is drudgery with no meaning, and we can't give it one. All life's efforts, love, family, power, money, etc., ultimately lead to no meaning. In this absurdity, we can only embrace the absurd, taking ownership of our meaningless drudgery and obtaining an absurd contentment in nothing. He says it would be a mistake to say that happiness is necessarily springs from the absurd discovery. Embracing absurdism drives out of this world a God who had come into it with dissatisfaction and a preference for futile sufferings. Hope in a meaningful afterlife is ingenuine and only breeds more despair in the present life. So some reflection on this. There is something gloriously liberating about Camus' absurdism. With no meaning and no ethics, we have no constraints. But where does this freedom leave us? Empty. There is no meaning or true happiness to fill the void. Inventing meaning is as foolish as wishful thinking. Here's the main question. You may have pleasure, but does your life have true meaning? Now let's look at a contrasting view, William Lane Craig's The Absurdity of Life Without God. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, we have people who not only maintain an Aristotelian tradition, but also the medieval Christianized understanding of ethics. William Lane Craig agrees with Camus and Nietzsche that life without God is absurd. Both Nietzsche and Camus said there is no meaning in the universe and no God to give it one, nor do we want a God who will. Craig's thesis is that life without God has no ultimate meaning, value, or purpose, and this view is unlivable. An important contrast with Bernard Williams, C.S. Lewis, Albert Camus, and William Lane Craig, we propose the most extreme implications of either continuing with medieval tradition of philosophy or continuing with its rejection in modernity and post-modernity. So here's the major contrast, alright? So you think back to the beginning of this video where we have the Enlightenment branching off, and we have the furthest implications of the Enlightenment and the furthest implications of continuing with the classical tradition of philosophy in these contrasting views. Craig says, man, writes Lauren Isley, is the cosmic orphan. He is the only creature in the universe who asks why. Other animals have instincts to guide them, but man has learned to ask questions. Who am I? Man asks. Why am I here? Where am I going? Since the Enlightenment, when he threw off the shackles of religion, man has tried to answer these questions without reference to God. But the answers that come back were not exhilarating, but dark and terrible. You are the accidental byproduct of nature, a result of matter plus time plus chance. There is no reason for your existence. All you face is death. Modern man thought that when he had gotten rid of God, he had freed himself from all that pressed and stifled him. Instead, he discovered that in killing God, he had also killed himself. For if there is no God, then man's life becomes absurd. If God does not exist, then both man and the universe are inevitably doomed to death. That the person I call myself will cease to exist, that I will be no more. Whether it comes sooner or later, the prospect of death and the threat of non-being is a terrible horror. My life is just a momentary transition out of oblivion into oblivion. And the universe too faces death. Scientists tell us that the universe is expanding and everything in it is growing farther and farther apart. So not only is the life of each individual person doomed, the entire human race is doomed. There is no escape. There is no hope. He maintains three general theses within his main thesis. The universe has no meaning apart from God. We want to leave an effect on the world, a legacy of some kind. When we die, we want to know what difference our life made. He says, suppose the universe had never existed. What ultimate difference would it make? The universe is doomed to die anyway. In the end, it makes no difference whether the universe ever existed or not. We try to find happiness and meaning in love, family, service, money, power, etc. In the end, they don't make one bit of difference. Not one bit. Each person's life is therefore without ultimate significance. And because our lives are ultimately meaningless, the activities we fill our lives with are also meaningless. All these are, in the final analysis, utterly meaningless. This is the horror of modern man. Because he ends in nothing, he is nothing. Ultimately, we just kill time waiting for what we don't know. Albert Camus understood this too. He saw life as absurd. At the end of his brief novel, The Stranger, Camus' hero discovers in a flash of insight that the universe has no meaning and there is no God to give it one. 2. The universe has no value. He says, if life ends at the grave, then it makes no difference whether one has lived as a Stalin or as a saint. Since one's destiny is ultimately unrelated to one's behavior, you may as well just live as you please. As Dostoevsky put it, if God is dead, then all things are permitted. On this basis, a writer like Ayn Rand is absolutely correct to praise the virtues of selfishness. Live totally for self. No one holds you accountable. Indeed, it would be foolish to do anything else, for life is too short to jeopardize it by acting out of anything but pure self-interest. So this is to ask the question, why be moral? And Craig is saying there's no reason to be moral if there's no God to keep you accountable. In a world without God, who is to say which values are right and which are wrong? Who's to judge that the values of Adolf Hitler are inferior to those of a saint? The atheist philosopher Richard Taylor says, to say that something is wrong because it is forbidden by God is perfectly understandable to anyone who believes in a law-giving God. But to say that something is wrong, even though no God exists to forbid it, is not understandable. The concept of moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God. The words remain, but their meaning is gone. So reflect on this for just a second. This is an atheist philosopher who says that moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God. That means, since he is an atheist, and he does not believe in God, therefore he does not believe in morality. In a universe without God, good and evil do not exist. There is only the bare, valueless fact of existence, and there is no one to say you are right and I am wrong. 3. The universe has no purpose. If death stands with open arms at the end of life's trial, then what is the goal of life? Is it all for nothing? Is there no reason for life? And what of the universe? Is it utterly pointless? If its destiny is a cold grave in the recesses of outer space, the answer must be yes. It is pointless. There is no goal, no purpose for the universe. If there is no God, then our life is not qualitatively different from that of a dog. As the ancient writer of Ecclesiastes put it, the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there is no advantage for man over beast, for all is vanity. All go to the same place. All come from the dust, and return to the dust. Without God, the universe is the result of a cosmic accident, a chance explosion. There's no reason for which it exists. Do you understand the gravity of the alternatives before us? For if God exists, then there is hope for man. But if God does not exist, then all we are left with is despair. Do you understand why the question of God's existence is so vital to man? As one writer has put it, if God is dead, then man is dead too. Here's the conclusion from Craig. Craig, Nietzsche, and Camus all explicitly state that the universe is meaningless if there is no God to give it one. They also all say that people naturally seek for meaning. With this paradox, we are left with these options. Absurdism. Embrace the meaninglessness and stop seeking for meaning. Theism. Believe in God and seek a meaningful life. How do we get to these two options in the history of philosophy? Absurdism is the implication of the Enlightenment. The opposite course was to not reject the medieval metaphysical foundation in human nature for morality and a meaningful life, which Christians say is ordered by God. Are there other options available? Sure, there's a whole spectrum in between. However, Friedrich Nietzsche, Albert Camus, Bernard Williams, C.S. Lewis, William Lane Craig, and Alasdair MacIntyre all agree that there are only two options. In other words, in order to be consistent, in order to not live a complete contradiction, in order to really understand philosophy and its implications, we are left with only two options. Anything in between is a contradiction and will ultimately lead to one of these two anyway, according to these authors. Let's look at MacIntyre's assessment of our current historical predicament in the philosophy of ethics. This comes from Alasdair MacIntyre's After Virtue, in the first couple chapters entitled A Disquieting Suggestion and The Nature of Moral Disagreement Today. Alasdair MacIntyre assesses the current state of moral philosophy and how we got here. Here's the situation. We are so immersed in a problem that we can't see it. Well, what's that problem? Here's an illustration to go on. Imagine what the world would be like if the natural sciences were destroyed, then recovered in a fragmentary way. So terms and formulas, numbers, and some fragmentary ideas in science are remembered without their foundation. We understand a few things about science, but don't understand how they are connected or the reasons they are important. So here's the problem. Modern moral philosophy uses terms that are now empty because they were based on a metaphysical foundation, and largely influenced by the Bible, that was rejected in the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment project failed to find a new foundation for old morals, as Nietzsche rightly observed. The issue here is philosophers can't agree because they can't use metaphysics. They have a non-convergence of premises in moral reasoning. So today, morality is discussed in emotivist terms, while using rationalistic language. The words moral, reason, and obligation assume universal objectivism, but culture holds to individualistic emotivism instead. So here's an analysis of today's moral discussions. 1. We can't settle moral disputes because we have no common rational foundation. Second, everyday arguments are presented as impersonal, rational arguments, but they contradict this by claiming emotivism, that morals are preferences. In other words, we daily say, that's wrong, which uses objectivist language, but we only mean, I don't like that, in emotivism. There is no consensus of premises because ethical terms are divorced from their historical foundation in metaphysics. So the result of this is moral pluralism, an anarchy of moral subjectivism that leads to a severe decay of morals. If morals are just preference, nobody has any obligations, nobody can agree, and philosophical debate degrades into shouting matches and mobs. In fact, we seem to see that on the political scene today, where political debates have decayed from a rational argument into shouting matches. And demonstration on college campuses or in public squares turn into violent protests where people are just shouting at each other. Why? This is because there's no possibility of reasoning together or arguing together because we no longer share any premises. What is the foundation for morality? The main points from this. The problem is the decay of morals in society and the inability to agree or argue about morality. The cause is emotivist rejection of metaphysical foundations for morality. So emotivism is key here. The solution is to recover a metaphysical foundation for morality. What are we left with? To illustrate how we got here, philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre in After Virtue recounts the voyage of Captain Cook to the Polynesian Islands. He and his crew found a people who labeled socially unacceptable actions taboo, such as cannibalism. We asked why these actions were unacceptable. They had no answer. MacIntyre says that it is evident that their tradition once had a reason that is now forgotten. Taboo rules have a two-stage history. 1. When originally formed, taboo rules have intelligible justification within their social context. There is a reason the people developed an aversion to these types of actions and labeled them taboo. 2. In the second stage, these taboo rules lose their original context and appear as a set of arbitrary prohibitions. Without a justifying reason, social morals appear arbitrary and the next generation easily discards them, reinventing morality however they like. So this is to depict that our traditional morals and moral language are now empty terms because they are separated from their original foundation in metaphysics and their social context in the medieval world. And so now that we don't know the foundation, they are easy to reject. In the end, we are left with choosing the logical conclusion of one of the following. The Enlightenment, which leads to nihilism, and later absurdism, that there is no meaning in the universe and no truth and no goodness, no good and evil. Or the recovering the foundation of objective morality that was lost in the Enlightenment. This is Alasdair MacIntyre's assessment. MacIntyre says that ethics boils down to a choice between Aristotle and Nietzsche. C.S. Lewis says, we all want progress, but if you're on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. In that case, the man who turns back the soonest is the most progressive. What was rejected in the Enlightenment? Nietzsche says it rejected God as the foundation of morality. MacIntyre says it rejected the metaphysics of human nature as a universal teleology. As a Catholic, MacIntyre says human nature is created by God, and the universal telos that constitutes the meaningful life and the goal of morals is union with God, or the beatific vision. There are many different philosophies to choose from, but MacIntyre says the options ultimately reduce to Nietzsche versus the Aristotelian tradition. Here's the thought progression of emotivism to see how the Enlightenment has influenced our culture today, and what are we left with in our culture today. First, the Enlightenment rejects the metaphysics of human nature as the ethical universal teleology. This is the foundation for ethics that the Enlightenment rejected. Emotivism is proposed, and it defines morals as expressions of opinion. No objective standard can judge between two people's opinion, because morals are just opinion. Culture adopts emotivism, and subjectivism and pluralism become the norm, encouraging tolerance for all. So subjectivism says that ethics is determined by individuals. What's good for you may not be good for me. I choose what's good for me. And pluralism says that there are many different views, many different possible views, and they are all equally valuable. All these opinions are equally valuable. So these become the norm and encourage tolerance for all. We tolerate all of these different possible opinions. So the phrase, you should do the right thing, becomes individualistic tyranny, forcing people to conformity. So when I tell someone, you should do the right thing, or you should do this, or you should do that, then it is individualistic tyranny, where I am trying to force my opinion on someone else. Individualistic tyranny. So every moral opinion other than mine ends up being seen as hostile towards mine as it tries to change me. So if somebody else tells me that what I'm doing is wrong, and if morals are just an expression of opinion, then when someone tells me I am wrong, all they are saying is, I have a different opinion than you, and I am trying to force you into my opinion. So that means that anybody who has an opinion that is different than mine is by definition hostile towards my opinion. So the question, who's to judge what's right and wrong, is answered no one. You can't tell me what to do. Tolerance ends up decaying from conversation and critical thinking into censorship of hate speech in the name of tolerance, as tolerance becomes intolerant of diversity and thinking for yourself. So there still clings on some common concepts where we don't like hate speech. We don't like it when people tell us what to do. And so when people do tell us what to do, and if people have different opinions than us, then we label anything we don't like hate speech. And we label anything that we don't like intolerant. And so, in the name of tolerance, we have become intolerant of all views that do not agree with our own view. Ethics becomes moral anarchy, where objective morality is seen as hostile. Meanwhile, terrorism increases, and mass murders become more frequent. And nobody is allowed to judge what's right and wrong, because we have thrown out objective morality. Now let's do the write-up for the state of ethics today. Why be moral? What's the motive? Why should you care? Why not just do whatever you want? Why should you be moral? Is your answer to that question a universal? Is it universally applied to everyone? Why be moral? Why should someone else be moral? Why should society be moral? Why should I be moral? Is this a universal answer? If morals are opinion, is there anything preventing moral decay in society? More importantly, if morals are subjective, can we even say there is moral decay in society? Or we want moral progress, for example, past racism or oppression, and we want freedom, etc. What standard do we use to measure progress? How do we even become aware of progress? If progress already assumes some kind of measuring rod, some kind of standard, how can we call it progress? It seems like it would simply be change and not progress if there is no exterior standard.